Yeah, so today Tinder has these three different subscription tiers plus a set of in-app purchases. The different subscription tiers are designed to appeal to different people and different willingness to pay. Each one of these monetized products is essentially focused on how do we get you matches more quickly, how do we help you match with the right people, and how do we help you get into conversations with the people that you've matched with. I think it's really important for monetization teams to put themselves in the frame of mind of what does the consumer want? How are they getting value? And how do we monetize the value that they're getting rather than try to extract from it? And if you can do that, then you can create these monetization mechanisms that work really well for the company because they work really well for the user.
Welcome to Subversive, a podcast dedicated to sharing stories from the best consumer subscription apps in the world. We'll bring you lessons for how to grow your consumer subscription business, including insights and inflection points that led to exponential growth from leaders at category-defining companies and innovative startups. Let's get into the show. My guest today is Ravi Mehta, the former chief product officer of Tinder, which is the largest dating app in the world and one of the most viral consumer subscription products of all time. In today's episode, I talked to Ravi about the inherent challenges of the dating category and how Tinder has overcome relatively high churn rates among its users and subscribers by innovating on monetization strategies to capture more value from its best subscribers early in their user journey. So before we jump into the topic for today, Ravi, which is going to be all of the innovative monetization things that Tinder has done, let's just start with a little bit about your background. Can you tell me a little bit more about your career leading up to Tinder and then what Tinder looked like when you joined the company?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been a product leader my entire life. I started programming when I was really young and fell in love with technology. I started a game company in high school, did that in college, dropped out for a little bit to do that full time, and then joined at a really interesting time at Microsoft when Microsoft was making a multi-billion-dollar investment into the gaming industry. I didn't realize what that was going to be at the time that I joined, but was excited to be involved, and that turned out to be Xbox. So I joined the Microsoft team right as they were launching the Xbox product. I was one of the first 20 or so people on the team, did a lot of early work around multiplayer gaming, and that kicked off a thread that I've had throughout my career. I've focused on consumer products, and I've primarily focused on consumer products that have some social element to them, some way of connecting people together. So key things that I've worked on, I was the head of consumer product at TripAdvisor for about 5 years, helping to really help the company transition from being very review oriented, being very user generated content focused to much more of a transactional marketplace. I led a team at Facebook focused on Gen Z. I was the chief product officer at Tinder. And for the last 4 or so years, I started a company. I've also done a bunch of solopreneur work, helping companies with their product strategy and helping them accelerate their product development, helping them hire product leadership, that sort of thing.
So as a fellow lover of consumer products, I have to ask, was it an accident that you ended up in consumer tech? B2B is often the path of least resistance, but what was it that drew you to consumer products in particular?
I started using tech when I was young and started in games, and have always thought about tech not just as a way to create business results, but as something that people find entertaining and rewarding and fulfilling that can change everyday people's lives. And so that was the thing that I focused on from a tech standpoint. And I've always been attracted to those problems that are more consumer oriented than B2B focused. I've had a little bit of B2B experience, but even in that B2B experience, employees are people too. And I think if you take a consumer mindset towards business software, as a number of successful companies have done, like Slack, for example, you can create things that are able to break through the noise.
Yeah, I agree. It's amazing to watch the influence that consumer tech products and teams have had on B2B over the last few years. But let's get back to Tinder. So you had stops at Microsoft, Xbox, at TripAdvisor, and then around 2019, you found your way to Tinder. What was it that attracted you to that company around that time?
It's a few different things. I think as my career has progressed, I've really focused on problems where I feel like there's a big impact to be made. I've been working for the last year primarily in healthcare. There's a lot of opportunity to change people's lives through making healthcare more affordable and more accessible. And if you think about the relationships that people have in their lives, what's the single most important relationship that you typically have? It's the person that you're married to. And although, Tinder has this kind of reputation as a platform specifically for casual relationships, that's not true in practice. It's the largest dating app for casual relationships. It's the largest dating app for long-term relationships. Something like 30 to 40% of people who meet their significant other now in the US do it through an online platform. And so it's something, it's a social product that millions of people use every month. When it works really well for people, it creates life transforming outcomes. And I was really excited to be part of a product that has that sort of impact. In addition, I'm also attracted to spaces that are changing really quickly. And one thing that I saw at Facebook is that the needs of younger users are changing really fast. At the time I was at Facebook, which was 2017 timeframe, we were seeing people move off of Facebook and onto Instagram and Snapchat really for two fundamental reasons. One, social media was getting more visual, it was getting more video centric. That was something that people could find more on Instagram and Snapchat and eventually on TikTok. And two, the sort of feed-based, broadcast-based way of communicating with folks was changing, and people wanted more intimate settings to communicate. They wanted to do more of their social networking in messaging-based products rather than in feed-based products. So that was another thing that was changing. And I was really curious when I joined Tinder in 2019 about how that is going to change for younger users. What does dating, what does social discovery look like for this next generation who is not just digitally native, but also social media native?
Yeah, well, first I have to say, when I first moved to San Francisco, I remember moving into my first apartment, and this was right out of college. And the previous tenant had only left one thing, but it was this poster that said the top 10 keys to success in life. And the first one was marry the right person. This one decision will determine 98% of your happiness or misery in life. And it could not
Absolutely.
be more true. I'm so grateful that I met and married the right partner. So
I am as
let's get
well.
back to, it sounds like the mission of Tinder is part of what drew you there, as well as just the rapid changes that were going on in the dating space circa 2010 when Tinder really got off the ground. And so you joined later in the company's history, but walk me through, to start with, kind of the origin story of Tinder, right? Getting off the ground on college campuses and how the company became so viral in the early days. And then we'll get to how that began to sort of slow down over time and when monetization started to become more and more important.
Tinder is one of these rare stories of a product that had nearly instant product market fit. And it was just a product of the moment that was solving something that people really needed and were clamoring for. So prior to Tinder, most of the dating products were designed for a desktop era. And so they were designed for you're going to sit down, you're going to spend 20, 30 minutes completing a profile. In order to upload pictures, you're actually going to have to find your digital camera. You're going to have to plug it into your PC. You're going to have to do the upload. So they were designed for this kind of high friction onboarding. And as a result, there was only a certain segment of people that were using dating apps. It wasn't anyone that wanted to meet new people. It was people that had such a significant need that they were willing to go through that really long onboarding process. And so Match and eHarmony catered to a very serious dater who's looking for a lifelong partner. And Tinder came in with a very different way of thinking about dating apps, and one that was really relevant to the moment. This was at a point when mobile had reached critical mass, and people were, instead of thinking about mobile apps as sort of big websites shrunk down to a small screen, they were thinking about it in terms of, well, what are the things that are unique about mobile, and how do we create something that works well with that platform? So Tinder has a number of things that are just tailor-made for mobile. One is the swipe mechanic. The swipe mechanic is a touch-based mechanism. The thing that inspired it was the idea of kind of walking into a bar or a nightclub and scanning the room and figuring out who you want to talk to. How do you create a mobile interface that is actually really similar to that? And the swipe works very well on mobile. So that was the first thing that was really mobile native. The second thing that was mobile native is Tinder is an inherently location-based app. You see the
Mhm.
people that are around you, the people that are close to you, rather than having to search in a particular neighborhood or a particular geography. So it just inherently knows where you are. And then the third thing that was really important was it connected to Facebook. And so you could sign in with Facebook, you would get access to all of your photos. You could just quickly pick the photos that you wanted. You could eventually take photos with your camera or pull them from your camera roll. And then the profiles were really light. They were something that you could type in on a mobile phone. So in a matter of maybe under 5 minutes, maybe even under 2 minutes if you're going really fast. You could go from being a first time user who's just downloaded the app to someone who's actually swiping on people in your area. And that lowered the friction to get into a dating app. And as a result of lowering that friction, it massively increased the addressable audience. And it took all these people who are window shoppers who would never go through that 30-minute process of filling out a profile, but wanted to meet someone, brought them into a dating experience that was just tailor made for mobile at the time.
Yeah, and I want to double click on that point because you'll hear people say often, mobile's a new platform. It creates all sorts of opportunities for new consumer apps. Or now, AI is a new platform or new wave. It creates all sorts of new opportunities. But the devil's in the details. And you highlighted there a few examples of native mobile features that Tinder tapped into at the perfect moment in time to fundamentally lower the bar on singles entering the online dating pool, and particularly younger singles. And so can you talk a little bit more about how the product innovations that Tinder built into this viral mobile app then contributed to its explosive success, first at USC and then other college campuses around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that the early Tinder team did incredibly well was knowing where to reduce friction and where to increase friction. And so a lot of the friction was reduced in the onboarding. Let's get people in the product, let's get profiles built quickly. But then one area where they added a lot of friction, which helped a lot in the early days, was in order to talk to someone, you have to have double opt-in matching. So not only do I have to swipe right on you, but they also have to swipe right on me. And only then can we communicate with each other. And that was actually very different than the dating apps at the time, where you could message anyone on the platform and they could message you. And the thinking was, well, we want to reduce friction. We just want to get people talking to each other. But the insight at Tinder was actually you only want to talk to someone if you're interested in them and they're interested in you. And there's kind of this initial Tinder, this initial spark. Then you can have a really good conversation that's going to work well for folks, especially on mobile where it's more intimate and where you're actually getting messages delivered to your phone and it's almost like chatting with a friend. And so by taking that approach of understanding where to lower friction and understanding where to increase friction, they were able to create something that worked a lot better for folks. And they were also able to create something that felt really relevant for younger users. So the initial place where they went to market was USC. A number of the founders were associated with USC. They started with Greek life, so they started with fraternities and sororities. It was a viral product in the true sense of things, in the sense that a lot of it was word of mouth. So they would introduce the product to a specific particular frat or a particular sorority, have everyone set it up, get profiles. Just because it was location based, you'd see the other people at USC that had it, other people would get set up. And then it just created this moment where very quickly you went from a few people on campus to using it to nearly everyone on campus using it. And in that way, that initial viral loop looked a lot like the early days of Facebook, where a lot of successful consumer social apps typically will pole vault themselves on some other community or network. And so campus communities and networks are a really good way to do that because they're very close knit and you've got a bunch of people in a small area who likely want to meet each other. And once Tinder found that was working really well, that was a playbook that could then be scaled to every college in the US and then eventually be scaled past that as well.
So let's talk about that. You enjoyed several years of essentially free growth on college campuses, given the dense network effects and the inherent viral quality of the product. At some point, you start to saturate US college campuses, or at least you've captured most of the early adopters on those campuses. How did the company find ways to tip the scales in order to move beyond college campuses and attack other highly dense networks that were maybe among adult populations?
Yeah, there was a series of things. And so one thing I think the company was really good at was identifying this core insight around tight networks and then figuring out ways to productize that. So one of the early ways that accelerated on-campus growth was creating a really strong ambassador network. And that is something that exists both today for Tinder as well as for Bumble. And now, dozens of companies have really good on-campus ambassador programs. And so that accelerated campus-based adoption. One of the other things that Tinder layered on top was to say, okay, we have a boots on the ground approach, but let's actually scale this within the product. And so Tinder launched Tinder U, which is kind of an in-product version of the
Hmm.
on-campus thing that you would get where, someone might introduce you to the product and then you could see not only who's on your campus, but also other colleges. And one of the key things around Tinder U is this concept of a swipe off. So colleges would actually compete for how many swipes they can generate. And then Tinder did an award, seasonally. And so that got the colleges not just interested in meeting each other, but also competing against each other. There are other networks that Tinder could take advantage of. So another thing that got created was festival mode. And so festival mode says, hey, if you're going, when you're not in college over the summer, there's a dip in usage. So how do we get people to use the product during those summer months? A lot of time people are going to festivals, whether it's Coachella or Stagecoach or others. So let's let people identify where they're going and be able to swipe on each other both before they get to the festival so they can meet each other and meet up when they're there, as well as when they're on site. Then there was another thing around understanding that people in close proximity at specific times of day would come onto the app. So there's kind of like a prime time for Tinder that happens in the evening
Hmm.
and at the end of the week. And so there's a really interesting product which takes advantage of that called Swipe Search, where we would notice that people are coming into the product at a particular time and then send out notifications to everyone within that region to have them come into the product. And that could create these moments of high engagement and activity where lots of people are swiping on each other, lots of people are getting matches. So the product is working well. And that was a way to think about, okay, there might not be something like a college or a festival that is organizing people together, but a community can also be thought of as a bunch of people in the same geographic area around the same time of day that are interested in meeting each other. And so how do we tap into that and use that as a growth lever?
Amazing. So Tinder starts on college campuses, first at USC, expands virally to other college campuses. As that gets harder, they figure out ways to sort of stack the deck to saturate those college campuses with things like Tinder U and campus ambassador programs. Then they move beyond college campuses into other dense networks within the US adult population. And now we're starting to get closer to the time when you joined Tinder in 2019. And so we'll get to the key
Yeah.
inflection point of this episode. Every episode of Subversive focuses on an inflection point. And so the inflection point is it's getting a little bit harder for Tinder to grow virally. And so monetization as a byproduct is becoming more and more important in order to unlock paid acquisition channels. So let's start with some of the inherent challenges of the dating category, right? Churn tends to be relatively high for dating apps because you have a product where if you do your job well and somebody meets their next partner or potentially their life partner, they churn off the platform and they may never come back. And so what are some of the ways that Tinder and other dating apps have overcome this in terms of capturing value from users earlier in their user journey?
Yeah, so this is a really significant challenge. And for the first 3 or 4 years of Tinder, it wasn't actually clear how Tinder would monetize. So all of this growth happened. There was all this support for the product, but there was almost zero revenue being generated. And so some of the thinking was like, okay, maybe advertising is the way to monetize this. So we're going to monetize it in the same way that other social networks monetize. And that's appealing because the user's not paying anything. And the main friction that I think consumer social apps have in terms of monetization is not adding so much friction that they actually impact the social network. So less new people are coming in, less people are engaging and communicating every day. So that was one of the main challenges that Tinder needed to solve for. The other thing is if people are coming in free to use the app and they're getting value from it and they're messaging each other and they're meeting each other, what is the right point within that flow to be able to introduce monetization without impacting the fact that the product is working for folks? And so one of the things that Tinder has done that has been really innovative, not just for Tinder, but across the entire dating industry, is to set up a pretty sophisticated monetization strategy that combines subscription-based monetization, where there's multiple subscription tiers, with microtransactions, so a la carte purchases that people can buy into as well. And each one of the things that's offered, each one of the features that's in the subscription tier, each one of the available in-app purchases is really designed to lift some inherent limitation of your usage of Tinder so that it gives you a superpower. And the most clear example of that is I can't see who swiped right on me. So part of the double opt-in match is I'm swiping on people, other people are swiping on me, and we match, and that's a magical moment, but you kind of don't know ahead of time who's interested in you. You just have to do the swiping to figure it out. And you may actually be missing matches along the way if you swipe left on someone who swiped right on you. So the most valuable feature that Tinder has is part of Tinder Gold, which is the ability to see who likes you. And it essentially allows you to break the rules of the game, right? The game operates in a certain way. You can break the rules. And now you can go through all of the people who have swiped right on you and very quickly decide who you want to swipe right on. And so it shortens the time between now and when you get a match. And it turns out that actually people, whether or not you swipe left or swipe right on someone is not an immutable thing. If you show someone that same person 3 weeks from now, they're 30% likely to change their opinion on them. So swipe right if they swipe left before.
Even in online dating, serendipity matters.
Absolutely. Right time of day, right frame of mind. It's really important. So, yeah, that's an example of one of the things that Tinder was able to discover as like a mechanic of the platform, that we can lift that limitation. If someone monetizes, that creates a lot of value for folks, and it doesn't slow down the engagement on the platform. It actually speeds it up.
Got it. And one of the things I know you've spoken about before in other forums is the importance of not only differentiating your premium value promise from your free value promise, which started with Tinder Plus. And my understanding is Tinder Plus was all about allowing users to get more swipes and more potential matches. But then Tinder Gold went a step further and had a premium value promise that was differentiated from Tinder Plus. And that was about getting more matches and more high quality matches. What about Tinder Premium, which was the third subscription tier Tinder launched, as well as the in-app purchases you talked about, boosts and super likes? How did they fit into this matrix of different premium offerings that Tinder offered?
Yeah, so today Tinder has these 3 different subscription tiers plus a set of in-app purchases. The different subscription tiers, Tinder Plus, Tinder Gold, and Tinder Platinum, are designed to appeal to different people and different willingness to pay. And you could roughly think about it as Tinder Plus is being able to swipe more. Tinder Gold is about being able to get more matches, and Tinder Platinum is about being able to get into more interesting conversations. And so, I talked about the fact that Tinder Gold lifts that limitation that you can see who swiped right on you. Tinder Platinum has a feature where you can message someone before you've matched. And so that's like a really ironclad rule of Tinder, as it's always been, is you can't message someone until you've matched with them. For Tinder Platinum users, they can a limited number of times say, hey, I want to send you a message before you match. And that feature was inspired by one of the in-app purchases that Tinder has. So Tinder has a set of in-app purchases, but 2 of them drive a lot of the revenue. One is Super Like, and the other is Boost. And so Super Like says, rather than just swipe right on you, I can send you a Super Like, which is a paid thing, which shows that I'm really interested in matching with you. And if someone receives a super like, they're 3 times more likely to swipe right on you. And so if there's someone you really want to match with, it's a great way to try to create that match. Boost does something similar to what a lot of Boost products do, whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook. You show up a certain number of times within other people's algorithm. When you use Boost, the probability that you show up increases for a short period of time. And so each one of these monetized products is essentially focused on how do we get you matches more quickly? How do we help you match with the right people? And how do we help you get into conversations with the people that you've matched with?
And so one question that comes up when you have products that have both premium subscriptions and in-app purchases, these sort of one-offs, is the possible cannibalization of the subscription itself. What did you all observe at Tinder? Did you observe any cannibalization of your subscription tiers as a result of Boost and Super Likes, or was it actually complementary?
It's complementary. So the in-app purchases are very deliberately designed to be force multipliers of the features that you get within the subscription. So for example, if I have Tinder Gold and I can see who likes me and I can match with all of those folks, very quickly, I'll kind of run out of people who have swiped right on me because I'll decide, do I want to match with them or not? And so what do I want to do at that point is I want to get more people who have swiped right on me. The way that I can get more people to swipe right on me is I can buy a boost that can have me show up more in other people's feeds, and then I get more people who have swiped right on me. Or, if I see the people who have swiped right on me and I decide, there's some people I want to match with, some people I don't, but there's other people that I've seen that I really want to match with. You can send a super like. And so there is a risk if it's not carefully designed that subscription products and in-app purchases can cannibalize each other. There's a risk of any, I think, monetization product or even free features cannibalizing each other. And so that's why it's really important to think about not just what does the feature do in isolation, but how do they interact with each other and how do they either negate each other or force multiply each other. And so each of the features that's worked really well on Tinder and is now a core pillar of monetization has that effect of not just being valuable on its own, but being valuable when coupled with other products in the system.
So let's talk more about that, because I think the way you explained that was really important. On its face, having more subscription tiers, more in-app purchases sounds great, right? You can offer more premium products to more of your customers. You can capture more consumer surplus under the demand curve. In practice, it's very difficult. You've got to manage more complexity. It increases the complexity of the purchase decision for the consumer. You potentially cannibalize your higher value premium products with lower value premium products. So what needed to happen internal to Tinder? And this starts to get into your tenure there, because I believe you had launched Tinder Platinum right around the time you joined. What were some of the steps that the company took around premium value positioning and merchandising to make sure that all of these moving parts fit together?
A lot of it is, so one is having a strong set of principles around what the product is and isn't. And so what are the rules that are sort of immutable? What are the things that you're willing to change when you either, for all users or in the case of paid users? And I think one thing that Tinder has definitely had is a very clear perspective on what type of product it is and what it is solving for. And so one good example of that is one of the most requested features on Tinder is height. People want to be able to filter based on height. That's a key criteria when you're matching with someone. But Tinder very much has had the positioning of being a serendipitous way to discover people rather than be a search engine for people. And so it's avoided adding metadata that just says, oh, okay, I want to check off a bunch of things, and here's the people that I see, and I want to choose who I want to, because that takes a lot of the fun and the discovery and the serendipity out of dating. And as a result, Tinder's never added the feature that's been asked for the most. And so it's a good example of like sticking to your principles and knowing what those bright lines are. And when you know what those bright lines are, then it gives you a really nice framework within which to figure out what should be free and what should be paid. What are the things where we want to have zero friction? And what are some things where we're okay having some friction, not simply because we want to monetize as a company, but because there's a set of users who we know we're creating so much value for that they're going to be willing to pay for this because they themselves are getting more value. And so one of the other things is like this idea of, Tinder users can either use their time or their money to get more matches. And so I can spend more time swiping. Yeah. And that's a good inspiration. I think a lot of Tinder's monetization is inspired by social gaming, and some of social gaming's monetization is inspired by how Tinder's approach things as well. There's some really similar things there.
You've got the grinders and the whales, right? The grinders are just grinding away, spending hours every day, earning access to power-ups or more matches in this case. And then you've got the whales who are substituting time with money in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's very similar. And interestingly, like dating adds a couple nuances to that. So younger users tend to be willing to grind more because they don't have as much disposable income and they're using the product differently. They want to meet lots of people, whereas older users are typically wanting to meet someone for a long-term relationship and they have more ability to pay. The other thing is like when you have a whale, when you have someone who's spending lots, they're spending, not just the $30 or $40 a month for the subscription, but maybe $50 or $100 in-app purchases. They're doing it not for the entertainment of spending more time with the product, but they're doing it because of the utility of they just want to match with more people and they want to meet more people. So it's interesting to see that there's some different nuances, but there's a lot of similarity as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're going to get to the lightning round in a moment here, but before we do that, I guess one question I want to ask you is why don't you think more consumer subscription apps have moved in the direction of offering multiple subscription tiers and or in-app purchases? You see a lot of gaming apps do that, and the dating category has been one where both Tinder and Bumble do a lot of this. But outside of that, there aren't a lot of good examples. Why is that?
I think exactly for the reason that we just talked about, which is it does add complexity, it risks cannibalization. You can very quickly take something that is working and implement, a paid feature that actually breaks the experience, not just for the paid users, but also for the free users, especially if there's a social component or some way that users are interacting. And I think about all of this, the different subscription tiers, the in-app purchases, these are optimizations. These are not fundamental. If ultimately you can't make a single subscription tier work for your business, for your product, that's not a monetization optimization problem. That tends to be a product market fit problem. So focus on
Yep.
what is the product? What is the paid product that people really want and need? And once you've got a thriving, growing business, then you could think about, okay, there's some monetization that we're leaving on the table. We have some users that are less engaged, that have a lower willingness to pay. What can we offer them? We have other users that are really highly engaged. They're getting tons of value from our product. What can we offer them, which makes their experience even better? And so these are big optimizations. They can really help drive the business, but they require a strong foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of it probably just goes back to, as you said, you have to have product market fit and you have to have achieved a certain scale before adding the complexity of multiple subscription tiers and in-app purchases makes sense. And I've talked about this before, but there are over 100,000 consumer subscription apps in the app stores and less than 50 that have ever reached billion-dollar valuations. If
Yeah.
you're too small, you're probably not going to offer more than one subscription tier. So get one right, and then maybe at some point you earn the right to expand to two or three.
The other thing, which
I
I
guess,
just thought of, I think, which is
yeah, go
interesting,
ahead.
is that both for a lot of games as well as for Tinder, there is a lot of churn, right? So you're getting
Hmm.
users who are new users who, are willing to kind of explore different models for using the product as well as paying for the product versus a lot of apps like Netflix or Calm or Headspace. You have users who are creating a habit around this. And
Yep.
if someone has a habit around something, then they expect things to be steady and continuous. I want to kind of pay the same amount every month or every year. I don't want to keep
Yep.
being offered new things. If instead this is something which is less focused on habit and more focused on the novelty and on these, shorter duration use cases, then people are willing to engage with these paid products more often.
Well, and it goes back to business strategy too, because I don't think it's any secret that most of the big gaming apps earn an outsized percentage of their revenue from a very small percentage of their whales. And you've talked about how some of the gaming mechanics also make their way into the dating category. And similarly, I know you've mentioned before in the case study we teach in my course that, Tinder earned a pretty significant amount of its revenue from a relatively small percentage of users. What advice would you have for other consumer subscription app leaders who are looking to capture more value from their users and subscribers?
I think the first thing is to really understand what is the consumer trying to accomplish and how do they get value from the product. When thinking about monetization, it's really easy to think about the company's needs and put those first and say, okay, we want to increase revenue by 20%. Let's look at where we're getting a lot of users, what the conversion rates are, where we might be able to raise prices. Raise prices is a great example of something that is very company motivated rather than consumer motivated. No consumer wants to pay pay a higher price. They might be willing to do it, but they don't want to. And that actually changes the value surplus that they get from the product. Every time you increase the price, they might be willing to pay that higher price, but they're also getting less surplus value from the product. And so I think it's really important for monetization teams to put themselves in the frame of mind of what does the consumer want? How are they getting value? And how do we monetize the value that they're getting rather than try to extract from it? And if you can do that, then you can create these monetization mechanisms that work really well for the company because they work really well for the user. And if instead you're in this mode of sort of extracting, squeezing more juice from the lemon, yes, it's possible to do that. You can hit your year-over-year numbers by doing that, but that tends to get diminishing returns. And I think in a very sort of insidious way, it opens you up to disruption because it
Totally.
pulls a user who might be very intimate with your product further and further away from your product, and it gets them to a point where they're willing to consider alternatives.
Well, I loved how you described it as value surplus because I'd bring it back to, I talked about the subscription value loop, value creation, value delivery, and value capture, and they kind of have to work as a system. And the more value surplus you're giving away to your users, the more likely they are to share it with friends and family and post about it on social media because they're delighted. They have high net promoter scores and they want to tell the world about your product. But if you extract every last bit of that value, even if they don't churn,
Yeah.
and some of them will, they're not going to be as ebullient about your product. And so what that means is you end up getting less free organic growth, and you have to go spend some of that extra money you just made with the higher price buying users on Facebook and Google. And so you have to think about these things in a system. And I think it's, the best consumer products have figured out how to balance those tensions in a way that is optimally efficient. One last question is just, how did all of these efforts pay out for Tinder? To the extent you can share, what sort of impact did the expansion from Tinder Plus into Tinder Gold and Tinder Platinum, and the addition of boosts, super likes, and other in-app purchases, as well as premium merchandising strategies and ways of better explaining the premium value promises to users, what did that translate to in terms of incremental revenue or growth?
Yeah, so Tinder is significantly over $1 billion a year in revenue. If you look at it on a per monthly active user basis, it is a very strong performer in terms of revenue per user. Those years when we were really understanding this, implementing the products, implementing the merchandising to get people into these products are some of the fastest growth years in the company, where we were able to add north of $100 million in terms of year over year revenue increases. And so there are very significant impacts to the revenue that Tinder was able to get as a result of this line of thinking. The dating app space right now is in kind of a challenging phase where there are diminishing returns. I think the opportunity to acquire users has diminished because, if people want to use a dating app, they're aware of them, they're using them, so that the addressable market has been saturated, which is both a good thing. That's the price of success is running out of customers to sell to.
Victim of your own success.
Exactly. And so I think the dating app industry is in that boat right now. I also think in monetization, like, prices have been going up. They've been adding more products. They've really been trying to get the most revenue per user. And as a result, I think we're seeing a little bit of this. It's just gotten too expensive and people are looking for other ways to meet each other. And you see a lot more, people using Instagram or other products for social discovery and for dating. So great lesson around like how to really maximize monetization. And there's always this kind of like back and forth. What is the weak link in the chain for your product growth? Is it monetization? Is it engagement? And I think now we're in a time in the dating industry where it's actually not monetization. The industry is doing a fantastic job of monetizing the users they do have. And there's an engagement problem. And the question is, how do you get people to use these products more consistently and reduce the churn rates and just increase overall engagement?
Yeah, so maybe to wrap things up here, I mean, the way I've interpreted a lot of what we talked about today is, again, if you think about it in terms of the 3 steps of value creation, value delivery, and value capture, when Tinder exploded onto the scenes around 2010, the product was just so innovative, so perfectly suited to the mobile form factor that they generated a huge amount of value for users, and they weren't monetizing it at all. So there's a huge amount of value surplus, to use your word. And that led to extremely cost-efficient value delivery because it just spread virally. But then at some point, around the time you joined in 2019, that organic growth loop was starting to slow down a little bit. There was more and more focus on capturing value from users and subscribers, maximizing the value of those whales. And that drove another inflection point, which was the inflection point we talked about today, hundreds of millions of dollars in incremental revenue growth. But then at some point that comes at a cost, and it makes it even harder to acquire users organically or to engage and retain them. And you start to open yourselves up to disruption through Instagram and other free alternatives. And so it sort of goes full circle. And now we're back to how can Tinder innovate on value creation and value delivery again in order to keep users happy.
Absolutely. And I think every business goes through that. You may go through it at different paces and in different order, but there's typically a weak link, and there's typically, once you do a really good job solving for that, that doesn't solve all problems. It just, creates new problems or highlights other problems that you need to solve for.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're going to finish up with the lightning round. So I'm going to ask you a few questions.
All right, sounds
they're
good.
meant to be rapid fire. So, 1 minute answers or less. The first one is, what was the best part of working at Tinder, and what's one thing you would have changed?
The best part of working with Tinder was actually talking to people. And you would say, I work at Tinder. And they'd be like, oh, I met my partner. I met my significant other on Tinder. And you get into these really interesting stories, and sometimes where I least expected it. So that was really fun.
That's so funny you say that. I have to relate quickly. It's a tangent. But when I worked at Quizlet, which was one of these other, sort of ubiquitous ed tech companies, I hadn't even heard of Quizlet until I went home for the holidays one year, and all of my younger cousins were like, oh, you're joining Quizlet. I've been using Quizlet for years to study for my tests and prepare for homework assignments. And then I would like walk into Starbucks and a barista would see my Quizlet hat or my Quizlet shirt and be like, "Oh, you work at Quizlet? That's amazing. I love Quizlet." I had a flight attendant do it once. And so that's fun when it goes back to why it's great working on consumer products, because you get all these people who come out of the woodwork and tell you how much your products impacted their lives. So that's really cool to hear.
Absolutely.
Besides Tinder, what's your favorite consumer subscription app and why?
Let's see, my favorite consumer subscription app. It's not necessarily consumer, but one I've been using recently that I absolutely love is Screen Studio. So it is a screen recording app, but what it does is as you're recording, it figures out what you're focused on. So it follows your cursor and then it zooms in and it creates these like beautiful animations, and then you can narrate them if you want. And it's just such a nice way to create demos. It's kind of like Loom on steroids, especially if you want to share stuff on YouTube or on LinkedIn or other places. And it's just an example. One, it's like a beautifully designed app. It's really thoughtful from a UX perspective. It solves a use case that I've always had, which is I don't want to spend a bunch of time editing a video. And it kind of does that automatically. And so it's a subscription-based app. It actually just went from a one-time payment to a subscription. I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to sign up for this every month. Not because I didn't see the value, but just because I didn't want to necessarily move models. And I eventually, I did end up subscribing, and I really, really enjoyed it. I used it this morning, actually.
Cool. Yeah, I know you're working on your own startup right now, so I imagine the demo aspect of that product comes in handy often. And maybe we'll give you a minute at the end here to plug your new startup. In your experience, what's the hardest thing about working on consumer subscription apps or really subscription businesses of any kind?
I think the hardest thing is what we talked about in terms of understanding the consumer value, particularly for subscription apps. When you charge someone a subscription, there's kind of two things there's one benefit and then one headwind. A benefit is like sometimes people forget about the subscription, and then you just get all of this kind of free monetization because you're not creating value for people and they're still paying you. And yes, that's, it's good in some ways, but I also think it's bad because it dulls the senses around the real thing that you need to solve for is you need to provide enough value every single month that a person wants to continue to pay for your product. Because no matter, even if you have these kind of like dormant users, at some point they cancel. And where you're going to build your business is on the users who want to continue to use it. And so, Netflix is a really good example. Netflix invests a massive amount in content creation because they need to promise their user that every single month we're going to give you one or more shows that you're going to binge and you're going to love. And that is a heavy lift. Like your responsibility to the user never goes away. And in that way, I think it is different than B2B SaaS is often like you'll pay monthly for a utility. So you can create a utility one time, deliver that utility to the business user, and they'll continue to pay for it as long as they use it. Whereas consumers have a much higher bar. They want to be delighted and entertained and fulfilled every single month. Otherwise, they're going to cancel. And that is it's a wonderful business model. It grows in a compounding way, but it's something that you need to really be conscious of and building for.
Yeah, it really is challenging, especially just one subscription tier. But as you get into multiple tiers,
absolutely,
that helps to an extent, but it's still an inherent challenge of the subscription model. What's the most innovative growth tactic you've seen a consumer subscription app use recently?
Yeah, it's a good question. Innovative things are around lengthening the landing experience. And so there's been this kind of like wisdom around, you want to get people to the checkout screen as quickly as possible. Eliminate steps in the funnel so that it's just really easy. In a minute, you can go from consideration to purchase. What I'm seeing more often now, and this is something that we've done recently at Sesame, the healthcare company that I'm working with, is really lengthening the funnel. So we went from like a 3-page checkout experience to purchase our weight loss program to a 25-page checkout experience where we go through an entire intake where we ask the person about their weight loss journey. We ask them about their health goals, their medical history. We just get a ton of information about them that is really useful for the provider, but is also really useful for the patient to be able to consider what they're looking to achieve and how they're thinking about how this kind of fits into their life. And so we went from 3-page checkout to 25-page checkout, and our conversion rate went up by 40%.
Wow.
And
Noom is the canonical
absolutely.
example with the super long onboarding flow. And so it doesn't work in every category, but in some categories, it certainly works.
It really works well because you're essentially activating the user as part of their purchase experience. So by the time they hit checkout, they're not only They're not a customer starting from zero. They are already someone who's convinced, and that payment is just kind of one step along the path of them getting value because they've already started to get value.
Right. And then you've got the icing on the cake, which is you've gathered all that additional user data from them in onboarding. And so you can better personalize their experience.
Absolutely. And it works great in healthcare. It works well in fitness. I think there's other areas as well. Wellness is another area where it works well.
So last question, how will the consumer subscription app ecosystem change in the next 1 to 2 years? And I'll specifically add, how do you think AI is going to impact things like subscription strategies and pricing, given that a lot of these AI features have non-trivial costs associated with supporting them?
I think there's a push and a pull here. So, companies, because there are non-trivial marginal costs, are going to have to figure out how to monetize their AI features. So more companies are going to add additional subscription tiers. They're going to add, in-app purchase products. Companies that were free before, that were advertising supported, will now add subscriptions. And, I think what's going to happen with consumers is, AI is going to create a lot of value for them. And in some cases, they're going to be willing to pay for that. But I also think consumers are starting to get overwhelmed by the number of subscriptions that they're paying for. $10 a month, $20 a month stacks up really quickly, especially when you look at sort of the average income and where people are spending money in the US. There's already, I think, fatigue on, do I have a Perplexity account and a Cloud account and a ChatGPT account? And $60, $70 a month for that is actually a large amount to spend on AI tools. So I think there is a ton of opportunity that AI is creating. There's also going to be companies that are going to have to figure out how to monetize it. At the same time, I think consumers are going to be more finicky about what they're willing to pay for, especially on an ongoing subscription basis versus what they're not.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of subscription fatigue. And, 5 years ago, there were maybe 3 to 5 consumer subscription apps that everybody had.
Yeah.
And now there's hundreds of them out there, thousands. And so customers are getting a bit more discerning about what they can afford. Well, this was great. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today, Ravi. It's been such a pleasure having you, as always. Anything you want to say before we hop off here?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast. I always enjoy the conversations. I've enjoyed participating in your class. Yeah, if people want to find out more about me and about what I'm working on, just go to ravimeta.com. I have a Substack newsletter, which I'm trying to post to more often. So would love to hear from you and have you as a subscriber. I've also been working on a side project, which is a data analysis tool called gptcsv.ai. And our goal, especially for product managers or other people, user researchers who are working with a lot of open-ended text data, is to create a data analysis tool designed from the ground up to use LLMs to make analyzing that data easier and more powerful.
And I will say, I have used GPT CSV multiple times for my own client business, and it's a fantastic tool. So if you haven't checked it already, please do. Thanks again one more time to Ravi for joining the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.